Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver your homily for this lockdown weekend to your community. To Terry, thanks very much. And I'd start by acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal land. No matter where we're viewing this video, we are meeting on Aboriginal land that was never ceded, and pay my respects to the elders of all communities. So today I'm just going to give you an introduction to the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network's national inquiry, a people's inquiry that we've been running for the last 8 months. And the aim of that inquiry is really to reach out to people in the community to get out of the bubble of those that have already got quite good knowledge of Australia's foreign policy, our history of engaging in wars with the United States and the alliance with the United States, which is at the back of it all. So today I'm going to use a few slides to talk to you about the areas of impact that we believe are quite clear. The People's Inquiry is called that to look at the costs and consequences of the wars that we have engaged in, really since the last major world war, 70 years since Australia joined with the United States and others to wage war against the people of Korea. And from then on, you all know the history as we have continued to tag along with America's wars, to the terrible detriment of so many civilians. The death and destruction from those wars is never been calculated in numbers, but we all know just how significant that is. So I'm going to show you a few slides really about those 8 areas to encourage you to put your thoughts together and to write a submission to this inquiry, which I hope that, given that we're all in lockdown, you might find the time just to sit quietly, think about any one of these areas or more of the or combined areas that you might like to share your views in this groundbreaking People's Inquiry, because nobody has ever done this before, to ask the people of Australia what you think, what we think about our foreign policy. So I'll now just go to the slides and bring those up to share with you. So the first slide really is looking at just what I've been talking about, and that will maybe give you some sort of ideas. We were fortunate to have the support from 8 very well-respected community leaders coming on board to receive submissions in the areas outlined, which they have been doing since January this year. And you can see that that's the 8 areas, and I'll go through them one by one. So political and democratic rights. We're all very aware of the abuse of those rights in the case of Julian Assange, but so too in so many other ways. And again, you're probably aware of just the secret trials that are going on in Australia with witness K, just having received his sentence for sharing information that he thought should be known by the broader community in Australia, because his voice was not being listened to from within ASIO. So there's a lot going on, and since 9/11, this gives you a bit of a rundown on how many anti-terror laws have been passed in that period of time, with that famous individual whose face is on the screen. I'm sorry to have to do that to you. At the helm for a large chunk of that period of time. The impact on First Nations peoples. And this inquiry gives you a chance, to look at just what that impact has been. Particularly, we would like to think that we would get submissions from Indigenous Australians, many of whom, struggle, and much of that is to do with the fact that we do not prioritise recognising the long history of the First Peoples in this country, respecting that history, and responding in a way that is needed. In terms of the wars and the impact that has had on the First Peoples of Australia, well, the first thing that stands out in my mind is Maralinga, Montebello, the British tests on Central Australia, where it was talked about that this was a vast open land with nobody living there, and how wrong they were. So that is a great crime that was committed on our First Peoples, on the First Peoples of this country. But much more, I'm sure, when we think about it. The social and community impacts. US culture has had a huge influence on Australian culture, and we often hear, so often do we hear, how we share similar values. And I'm not denying that, Australians and Americans do have similar values. They're the values of human beings, which are shared not just with those two countries, but around the world. Human beings have got a sense of caring for each other, and it certainly doesn't belong to Australia or just belong to America either. But there is much more in terms of social and community. I think when we look at the abuse of community needs, which is, mostly financial, and we look at the financial expenditure of going to war and preparing for war, you have to look at that and think that this is wrong and needs to be addressed. Environment and climate change. And as the banner says, war costs the earth in so many ways. The amount of greenhouse gases that are expunged into the atmosphere during war, in preparations for war, is incredible. But the other important area, I think, that not so often gets mentioned is just how much of a roadblock the whole militaristic times we're living through in preparing for war and actually engaging in war, just how this gets in the way of what desperately needs to be done to address climate change, to address ecocide, and to get on with it. So that's another impact of the wars and our alliance. Military and defence. Well, ANZUS is lauded by people like Scott Morrison in the picture, but ANZUS, in fact, does not commit us to run off to war with the United States at a whim. It is merely a treaty that is enacted if one or the other country within the Pacific is under attack, and then they would have negotiations about supporting that partner in the alliance. Unfortunately, the alliance is much more than the ANZUS treaty. It is ideological, it's economic, it's very practical, as we see the build-up of American military forces on Australian territory. So much, much more to the alliance than the ANZUS treaty. Economic, and the elephant in the room, as Peter Catt told me just recently, is the whole economic system. The economic system depends on war. The economic system depends on manufacturing of weapons. It needs to not depend on those. We need a radical restructuring of our economic structure, our way of living, to have the focus on human well-being and survival into the future, which is, I'm sure you're all very much aware of. Unions and workers' rights. As I said, the ANZUS treaty is a small part of the alliance with the United States, which is ideological. And as we see the undermining of working people's conditions in Australia and further attempts being looked at, we need to remember that workers and unions borne the brunt of wars and the killing and the PTSD and the economies that are destroyed in the aftermath and during wars. So as I said, the economy being so enmeshed in militarism, and I, along with others, protested at the Land Forces Expo, the blatant, bloodthirsty, violent exhibition of weapons of war in Brisbane just a few weeks ago. We need a radical rethink. Our foreign policy, of course, is more or less determined by our relationship with the United States. It's a subservient relationship. We haven't grown up as a people, as a nation, and I think that definitely is what needs to happen. For that to happen, of course, I think we need to truly acknowledge the violence of the past in colonisation of this land, and that will be the starting point to us developing a sense of who we are and a confidence that goes with that strong sense of who we are and where we want to go to in the region that we live in, not in Europe, not in America, but in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia. That is where we live. Our communities, our people are diverse, with people from all over those parts of the world, and we've got to get going on that. Otherwise, we will continue along this path of the past. So, what can you do? Now, the important thing that you can do is to put in a submission. So, the submissions close on the 31st of July. From the time that the submissions close, each of those panel leaders will be reading them all as they have been going through them over the last 6 months, and they will each write up a report. Those reports will be sent to the overall chair of the inquiry, Ms. Kelly Tranter, and Kelly will compile an executive summary. Kelly's an investigative journalist, human rights activist, and lawyer. She's an amazing young woman, and she's done a lot of work supporting Julian Assange, as well as doing FOI on the exporting of weapons from Australia to Saudi Arabia and UAE. So Kelly will then write up the executive summary, and that will then go into the final report with each of the 8 reports. And we will be tabling that overall report in Parliament in the last sitting of the year in late November. So what you have to say will be recorded for history, and the report will then be used to disseminate it throughout as many levels of Australian society as possible, through academia, through the media, through the Parliament, to each parliamentarian, to each of the people who contributed their submissions, and to all of the organisations in IPAN and as broadly as we can, so that the report will be significant and your contribution will make a difference. So please take that time, and thank you very much. Now, at the beginning of this homily, I was going to read to you a poem, which was Terry's request, and the poem that I decided to read was Guantanamera, Jose Marti, who a Cuban man from the 1800s who was standing up for the peasants in their struggle against the colonists. It goes, I am a truthful man from the land of palm trees. Before dying, I want to share these poems of my soul. My poems are light green, but they are also flaming red. My palms are like a wounded fawn, seeking refuge in the mountain. With the poor people of this earth, I want to share my fate. The little streams of the mountain please me more than the sea. I hope you like it. Thank you very much.